Good morning. So between manhunts and rain and diplomatic intensity, we're really pleased to be here, and I'm delighted that Secretary Moniz could open this up today. As Amy just said, 1 year on from what was an extraordinary General Assembly last year, and then 9 months on from the extraordinary Paris Agreement, I think one way to think about this moment in time is that we asked and answered some pretty fundamental questions last year. Fundamental questions around the direction of development, fundamental questions about how we will develop, how we will meet everybody's needs within a world where we need to manage emissions down. And so, with Sustainable Development Goals and a Paris Agreement, we now need to pivot into well, how do we get this done? How do we, in the case of energy, which we're going to be talking about this morning, how do we engineer an energy transition so that we leave no one behind, so that we have an energy system that provides everybody with the energy that they need, cheaply, affordably, cleanly, and how do we do that in a way that produces jobs, that provides a smooth transition? How do we do that? How do we decarbonize while we grow? How do we end up in a better place earlier than 2030, because we need that energy system to be working for more people. We need it to be working affordably and renewably for more people earlier, because health systems depend upon it, education systems depend upon it. So 2030 is not really the end date for this transition. So thanks to leaders like Secretary Moniz and the critical way in which the US, working together with China, with India and others, shaped the possibility of those agreements last year, we are in a position where we can now really focus on what needs to be done. And I think here, what's really important is the leadership of business and government together working on the prioritization. You know, in the United Nations, we have 193 or more countries, everybody's equal, but there are some places and some things that need to be done need to be worked on as a priority. So hopefully we can get into some of that this week. I think when we look at a theory of change around the energy transition, then we are looking at putting energy productivity first. It's the cheapest, easiest way to achieve some of the gains that are needed to get ourselves on an aggressive path of managing emissions and providing ourselves with the kinds of energy that we need in the future. I'm sure Secretary Moniz will talk about the advances that have been made in the US economy on that front. The IEA says that energy productivity improvements could generate an additional $18 trillion in global GDP by 2035, and that energy productivity could reduce the cost of related decarbonisation efforts by almost $3 trillion. I'll let Secretary Moniz talk about the US approach to this, but the climate group's worked very closely with a number of you, and we have an initiative called EP100. And if 100 companies committed to doubling energy productivity by the year 2030, that would be 170 million metric tons of cumulative GHG emissions already reduced. So we put productivity first as the lens through which we look at an energy transition. Second, we've got to get those signals into the economy consistent and right. So that's the age-old problem of fossil fuel subsidies, the bad ones. It's the need to put prices on carbon. And the need to send a long-term signal into the economy that is predictable and leading business in the right direction. I think we need a responsible engagement on climate policy over the long run, which means that you shouldn't be spending your lobbying dollars saying something different than what you're lobbying for in terms of energy regulation. So a bit more consistency in the boardroom and a bit more consistency in the C-suite in some parts of the world, in some companies, in some sectors. And last but by no means least, we need continued energetic leadership, which brings me to Secretary Moniz. When we in Sustainable Energy for All look at this problem, we wonder how to make energy productivity the thing that people will run for office on. How do you make energy productivity the thing that brings people together around the cabinet table? How do you put it at the heart of delivery units in government, really striving for ambitious objectives? The question is, how do you make energy productivity sexy again? Well, you don't get any sexier than Ernest Moniz. And so, in my humble opinion, and so you're coming to the end of this...
I'm speechless already.
Well, it's grey outside, so I thought, So, I mean, here you are in the sort of last days of an administration which has achieved a lot and which is running through that finish line, right? There's no slowing down at all. Talk to us a little bit about what you've done, but also how much you think you can get done before the gavel comes down on a remarkable administration.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thanks for your leadership in SE for All, and of course the leadership of the UN and Ban Ki-moon has been critical, as has the leadership of President Obama. In fact, the kind of the bookends of the Obama-Xi announcements in 2014 and now recently in September in terms of signing on to the Paris Accord, I think have been very, very significant demonstrations of a real commitment to address climate. Let me focus on a few things in these opening remarks, and then be ready for a conversation. The last year has been obviously, well, hopefully will prove to have been the turning point for a much more aggressive global approach to climate change. I want to call out one event that should not get lost in the shuffle, and that is the announcement made by President Obama and by the leaders of 19 other countries in Paris on the first day of COP21, called Mission Innovation. That's with the capital M and the capital I. Most of you probably know about it, but just to emphasize, the key is that these 20 countries, now with the EU added in, have pledged to seek a doubling of energy technology innovation funding over the next 5 years. That's from a baseline of about $15 billion. So the idea is to really open up the innovation pipeline, if you like, and produce many more investable opportunities, which was in turn reflected in Paris by a parallel announcement made by Bill Gates, representing 28 international investors prepared to put in capital in a patient way. They understand 20-year horizons is kind of the name of the game in energy, to put it in a very risk-tolerant way, and furthermore to be prepared to make the very large capital investments for a few of the most promising technologies as they emerge, because we also know lots of good ideas have a hard time getting to those next stages of deployment. Now, I say that to say that I think this announcement and the enthusiasm internationally that we see for Mission Innovation really is about putting innovation now at the center of the discussion about solutions to climate change, bringing forward the solutions that we will need to accelerate the transformation to low carbon. Now, when that statement is made, many will then say, well, wait a minute, we actually have plenty of technologies today. What we need to do is to deploy them. Both statements are correct, because we have to be looking at this for the very long term. In Paris, obviously, we have a set of commitments, a big first step. I emphasize big and I emphasize first in terms of the commitments made typically in a 2030 timeframe to meet lower carbon goals. But our ambition doesn't end there. The ambition has to be elevated essentially continuously as we go to very deep decarbonization in the mid-century and beyond timeframe. So the way we look at it is deployment and innovation are actually completely synergistic and complementary. In fact, they often form the cycle that drives down the cost of these technologies. And we have seen that with wind, with solar, with batteries, with LED lighting and the like. But we are only at the beginning of that trajectory for a whole bunch of other technologies, including large-scale storage, carbon capture, novel nuclear. We could go on and on. So this is a long process. They are not in any conflict whatsoever. Quite the contrary. They are essential complements going forward. That was reflected in the meeting that we hosted in San Francisco in early June, and Rachel, you were part of that, where we intertwined two international groups. One, the Clean Energy Ministerial, which roughly speaking is focused on the deployment agenda, and Mission Innovation, the first ministerial level meeting, focused on that technology innovation agenda for the intermediate and certainly for the long term. And by the way, next year, the SEM meeting, and I think the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting will be in China, and the year after that in the EU, together with one of the EU countries. This innovation agenda, I also want to emphasize, is not only about electricity, because frankly, a lot of the discussions kind of drift very heavily towards electricity. That is critical because the electricity sector is certainly the first that we see being essentially decarbonized. But we also have to do transportation. We also have to do industry, which is a real challenge, frankly. And that's where I think we're going to need to have more breakthroughs, including breakthroughs in what I would call advanced carbon management for the long term, like large-scale CO2 utilization, for example, negative carbon technologies. So I think it's continuing the deployment and innovation push on the technologies that we are now deploying, but it's also preparing to go into these other sectors dramatically and to hopefully bring about one or maybe more of these major kind of carbon management strategies for the long term. Let me just end by adding two other points. Business. Clearly, business is obviously central to these solutions. What I want to focus on is here in the United States, and we do have a robust political discussion going on. I think that there has not been enough focus on the importance for business seeing clear signals, both on carbon and on financial structures, to start to make now the major capital allocation decisions that are required in the energy sector. We know these are decadal cycles for making these decisions and deployments. So even something like, let's say, carbon capture and sequestration, which many feel can become a significant contributor 2030 and beyond. But that doesn't mean we can wait to give the signals. So for example, the administration has proposed 2 years in a row tax incentives for carbon capture and sequestration. Some say, well, but it's not going to be deployed. But who's going to start deploying it without understanding the financial structure and ultimately the carbon signal? So I think it will be very costly for American business, and I won't speak about other countries in this regard, but certainly for American business, if we do not get those clear signals and stability now to be making those big investments. And finally, the last point, I do want to touch on energy access. Yeah, I think you know something about this, and jobs. Both are critical for us to address. On the jobs front, the Department of Energy published a first energy jobs report for the United States earlier this year. Defining an energy job is not so easy. It's easy for many jobs in, say, the solar industry, where we're over 200,000 full-time jobs. A big surprise was when we made an honest attempt to define energy efficiency jobs, we found 1.9 million and growing fast. That's a great story. However, we cannot ignore the distributional issues. In these transformations, some lose jobs and some gain jobs, and we can easily make the case there are more jobs being created. But they're not in the same place, they're not the same people. We can go to the energy access, maybe I'll leave that for you to elaborate on. But my point would be, not only is it a right thing to do to address these issues, I think it's a must-do for accelerating the transformation, because bluntly, the political headwinds will be much greater if we do not address these distributional issues of energy access and of jobs within our countries. So in conclusion, I would just say that I think certainly the administration, states, cities, I mean, certainly cities around the globe are doing their part. In the United States, we need now Congress to step up and put a legislative underpinning around a lot of these activities. With that, I will turn it back to you.
So I think that this is really interesting. What I wanted to do, because we don't have a lot of time, is the experience that you've gained being a cabinet level secretary and being in government, right? Because the way you're talking about the approach that this administration has taken, you're really talking about what one of the founders of the climate group used to call joined-up government. So it's the Treasury, it's energy, it's labour, it's environment, it's working together to manage the economy through something the likes of which we haven't tried to do before.
In fact, may I just jump in on that and reinforce that, Rachel? Because what I would say is, it's not so easy to define, for example, what energy policy is.
Right.
Is it actually environmental policy? Is it financial policy? Is it agricultural policy? Et cetera, et cetera.
So I think that, I mean, we see the awesome sort of challenge that poses for an economy and a government and a system as built out as the US or some other countries. So now I think one of the things that we see from Sustainable Energy for All is, you know, that for growing economies and for developing countries and some of the least developed countries, trying to get their arms around sensible decisions taken today that will reap a benefit as they grow and as they succeed. But, you know, not the institutional depth, not the access to managerial capacity. So do you have any sort of sense through the conversations in mission innovation, through the conversations in the SEM and elsewhere, the clean energy, what's the best way to help governments that just don't have that kind of bandwidth to plot a way through a transition, which is, as you said, complex and interrelated?
First of all, in terms of the issue of joining different parts of government together, I have to say there is no substitute for committed leadership at the top, right, because that's what makes different parts of government work together, frankly. We've certainly in the United States have benefited from that, as have many other countries in these last years. Now, if you look at, okay, if I take mission innovation as an example, the mission innovation countries, the 20 plus the EU, certainly there are quite a few, industrialized countries, but there are emerging economies and not quite emerging economies as well in that group. Very, very different levels of capacity for bringing all of these threads together. So, frankly, we are working as well on those issues. We always caution that there are. It's not easy to simply port something and have the same structure, but we certainly want to work together with countries and share our approaches. I'll give you one example. Actually, next week there will be a meeting in the UK on mission innovation, looking at some of the science and technology pathways. And one of the proposals, certainly, I have no problem discussing it here, that we will bring to the table is roughly 10 years ago, starting actually maybe 13 years ago, at the Department of Energy, a very important set of reports was put together, drawing upon a large community, well over 1,000 scientists and technologists, that defined the key scientific barriers to a whole set of technology innovation breakthroughs that we look forward to. Those then formed the basis of what has become an extraordinarily successful program called the Energy Frontier Research Centers. What we will be proposing is, a lot's happened in the last 10, 12 years. Why not now do this internationally with the MI countries? It is not, therefore, saying to any country what they need to focus on or prioritize, but let's come together and try to define these big challenges, and that will provide an interesting, I think, foundation for countries to define their portfolios and probably to define more international collaborations as well. So that's just one example that we are doing within the MI framework, where I think we can help stimulate the kind of research we want globally, but also, frankly, do a bit of capacity building for some of our members.
So I'm looking for a signal from, we're going to keep going in the absence of a signal, which is great. So can I just talk about the just transition? You talked about, you talked about the fact that there will be new jobs, but they won't be in the same place as the old jobs. It's generationally and geographically dislocated. So these are things that don't happen overnight. So how important is it that that there's a consistency from one administration to another, to another, to another, without, it's not just the top of the ticket issue, really. It's also the Senate, it's the Congress, it's the states. I mean, do you, to the extent that you can, I mean, do you see momentum building from the bottom up? I mean, it seems to me in this country, the people who understand the need for the transition most are the community health groups and the unions in the towns that are doing well and not doing well. I mean, it seems to me that in the public, there's a sense of what it means to them that just doesn't get represented in the national debate sometimes.
I think there's no question in the United States that the public is more and more not simply recognizing climate change. I think that's been the case for a while, but recognizing the need to do something about it. As you suggest, that's not always reflected in the political debate, but I think the ground truth is very much that that's happening. And frankly, shall we call it weird weather, is certainly a big part of that. And I think it's sinking in that the pattern that we are seeing about extreme weather events and the like is something that has been predicted for decades. It's not something new. So I think there is a strong movement there, and that's one reason why we see, we have 29 out of our 50 states have, for example, renewable portfolio standards. Cities across the country, as I say, are coming together to address this, and of course, urbanization, such a huge part of what we have to use to our benefit in addressing climate. So I think that's all happening, and I might say also in the Congress, the mission innovation discussions have attracted very considerable bipartisan support. Now, that's going to get translated into the numbers that we're talking about, although even this year, of course, this year's appropriations process is still not complete, but even within their fixed caps on the budget, they did reorient priorities to give us an uplift on the innovation agenda. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be guardedly optimistic. I will state quite frankly, I have a bet writing on the fact that we will have economy-wide legislation in the Congress by the end of this decade. I really believe that this is coming. I think the public is ready for it, and also I think the public, and frankly I think those in the political realm understand that ultimately a much more, the president put forward a very aggressive climate action plan, and I think it will get us there for our 2020 and 2025 goals. But I think there's no issue that rather than a sectoral approach, which is inherent in using administrative authorities, a simplified economy-wide approach would be preferable, and frankly would be a lot clearer in terms of the signals for business. So I think we have to get there. I think we will get there, and I'm a physicist, so I'm optimistic that it'll happen. I believe in rationality. I believe in the laws of physics, and so therefore it will happen fairly soon. Trust me.
So I'm going to wrap this session up. There are many political leaders, business leaders on the program for this Climate Week, and I think that you heard it from the Secretary, right? The kind of leadership that's needed now, right? The lift to get to a Paris Agreement was one big lift. To get to a sense of the shape of development, a sense of the shape of the urgency, that was a big lift. But now the challenge of leadership is setting that long-term direction, keeping your eye on the point on the horizon that we all said that we wanted to get to, warding off the buffeting political winds that would knock you off course, creating the bipartisanship that will be necessary in any economy in the world in order to be able to keep on steering in that direction. That requires more physicists, more optimistic physicists. It requires a sense of discipline in the finance ministries, in the energy ministries, in the environment ministries, land planning, you name it. This is a total government approach. And that requires business to absolutely continue to step up. Paris wouldn't have been possible without business implying that if government decides the right things, business will still succeed or will succeed even more. And the role that you have as a business community in conveying to government that policy environment is one in which we will figure out how to succeed, and we will succeed more than we've ever done before, because we've never had an energy system that was clean and affordable and served everybody, is, I think, a very important thing for you to cogitate on this week at this Climate Week. No more talk. It's time to roll up the sleeves, act, and thank you for your leadership over the last few years. And I think our biggest thank you to you would be to mimic your leadership and to push even further. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
There we go.